Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the game design panel. My name is Nick. My name is Ian, actually.
I got the name tags right? Yes, I do. Okay.
My name is Nick. You're Ian. My name is Ian, one of the Mythos Busters, and I'm here with Nick. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm well, now that I know who I am.
Got to keep you on your toes. Yeah, so we are two of the Mythos Busters podcast. This is part of FarcumCon 2020, in case you have wandered in here from some long forgotten corner of the internet. FarcumCon 2020 is a online convention focused around Arkham Horror the card game. Bunch of events going on. Please go and register if you haven't already, so we know how many people are part of this, and also join the special FarcumCon Discord channel if you want more info about all the events. So go join, go find those places and be part of it. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about our experiences designing both games in general and kind of Arkham scenarios specifically. We'll spend some time talking about our experiences and how we go about approaching those things, and then we will transition to what I think is going to be a lot of fun, is actually kind of spitballing with each other and trying to design an Arkham scenario, but based on suggestions from chat. So you're going to be able to suggest some of the key elements. And along the way, no matter what part of this panel we're on, feel free to dump questions in the chat and we'll try to answer them as best as we can. Hopefully related to game design, but sure, if you want to know what we're eating for lunch, that's fine too. But first, let's get started. And I think it makes sense first just to talk about who we are in terms of kind of what kinds of games have we designed, how did we get into game design, and just that kind of general intro piece. So, Nick, how did you get started with game design, and what kind of stuff have you designed before?
Sure. As most people who listen to the podcast know, I am very much. Very heavily into the role playing hobby. That I would say, despite doing a podcast about Arkham Horror, role playing is probably my number one gaming outlet. And so I got my start in designing games pretty young just by creating my own homebrew role-playing game stuff, whether that was classes and stuff for like old editions of D&D or just straight up whole new systems. Of course that never went anywhere because it was just me making it for myself and maybe a friend or two, but that was what kind of got my head in that space of designing games. From there, as far as what I've done on a yeah, there's the bingos. I'm gonna be we're gonna get so many bingo things hit already just from this stream.
Yeah.
But from there, what I have done officially is I designed and self-published a role-playing game in 2012 called Round 10. I would suggest you don't look it up because it's a mess. It's very obviously that's early in my design history. But then I
Sure.
did the Arkham scenario a couple years ago, Murder at the Excelsior Hotel, which was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed that. I've designed some unofficial fan made scenarios for Arkham as well. You can find those on ArkhamCentral.com. And then I'm currently designing another RPG system that is hopefully going to be a lot tighter and better designed than my first one. So that's kind of my history. Not a whole lot, only the one thing official, but otherwise a lot of stuff that I do independently.
Well, you got to get the bad stuff out first, right?
That's right. It's always
Get
a
it out of
learning
your system.
experience. Yeah, yep. You got to do some bad to make some good. So
For my part, yeah, similar that I've been designing games for kind of as long as I can remember. Um, I have a memory of being in like elementary school, and while the kids were out at recess, I was in the classroom like assembling this Super Mario board game, and the teacher was letting me use the construction paper and stuff. So yeah, and I always back when I was, I was in love with board games, during that era of like elementary school and middle school, but this was before, like, today there's so many cooperative games and solo games and it's kind of a hot category now.
mhm.
But when I was a kid, and I'm sure you had the same experience, there wasn't that big category of cooperative solo gaming. It was mostly competitive games.
Oh yeah.
So I think part of why I got into game design originally as a kid was just because I wanted to design games that I could play solo when
Mm.
I didn't have anyone to play with. So I remember designing like 3 different Star Trek games and a Gladiator game, and just all kinds of games. So anyway, as far as kind of more recently, I really started getting into design, I think, with designing custom scenarios for Lord of the Rings. Drink. um, and Lord of the Rings, the card game. So when I got big into that LCG and into that community, I designed a bunch of scenarios around the first stage of Middle Earth, since that wasn't something that the game could cover. Like, there's no way they were ever going to get Silmarillion license or any of that. I decided to take it upon myself to design a bunch of scenarios, and I think, how many do I have? 7 total. I think 7
Oh,
total
nice.
scenarios and a bunch of player cards. It was almost like designing a whole game because I wanted to design new player cards for characters that were only in that era.
Mm-hmm.
And then since then, kind of my one official credit is that I helped design the official Lord of the Rings scenarios, Escape from Khazad-dûm and Mines of Moria, which are like the special kind of build your own scenario kits where you can kind of customize an encounter deck with different encounter sets. So I helped Caleb, who is what is was the lead designer of Lord of the Rings, since it's coming to an end now, but I helped him design those scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
And then since then, I've been heavily working on a game design of my own, which hopefully should be out in some form before the end of the world.
And
So,
it's good. It's good, people.
yeah. So hopefully at some point people will actually get to play that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exciting.
So with that out of the way, I think from here we wanted to talk about just general game design process. So just thinking about, like, let's say you have an idea for a game
Hmm.
that pops into your head while you're in the shower or driving, as often happens for me.
You know it, man. You you know exactly when those come up. You're no stranger to that. That's for sure.
How do you go about starting to design a game? Like, what's your initial first steps of a design process for a game?
So for me, usually I'm very much in the camp of I have a theme. It's often a theme. Like I go like one that I had recently that I didn't really play with was I was playing the PlayStation game. Oh gosh, what's the name? Friday the 13th, which is a 1v many. It's like 8-on-1. With Jason chasing everyone down and killing and that sort of thing. And I was just like, there's a lot of 1v many games out there. There's a lot of hidden movement games and that sort of thing out there. I was like, I wonder, like, as I was playing that, and this is how I am with any game I play, I see it, I start to, like, equate the mechanics I see on screen with, like, dice and cards, and, like, I just suddenly start to see how it would fit together. So usually I approach game design with a theme first, and I go, okay, this is going to be an 8-on-1 hidden movement sort of game, or this is going to be an exploration-based, like, map expansion game. And then from there, I start to decide like what my main mechanics are going to be, and then kind of try and find the major gameplay loop. So what do I want players to be doing turn to turn? What do turns look like even? But I'm very much a theme first, top down kind of designer for the most part. But I say that, but then there are also times when I go the opposite way and I come up with a mechanic that I really like. And I'm like, well, there's no card game or there's no board game that does this. Like, why don't I expand this mechanic a little bit? Usually I end finding out that there's a reason why no card game or board game does that mechanic, and that's because it just doesn't work. But if you workshop it enough, you can usually end up getting something that's good with it. And then that feels good because then it's like, I know the bones are good. Now I can slap whatever I want on top of it and kind of retheme some things. But usually I'm very top down, I'm very big picture, and then I try to make that big picture fit into what a tabletop game, would look like. What about you, Ian?
Yeah, I think I approach it very similarly, where it's usually theme first. I'm trying to think about a time where I've designed with the mechanic first in mind. Maybe for like scenarios for a game, but
Hmm.
as far as general game design, yeah, I think it's always like I have a theme. Like, I want to do a space game, or I want to do a gladiator game, or something like that. Like, that's what
Hmm.
pops into my head first. And then it's really the game design process often for me is like translating that kind of whatever that theme is into mechanics is usually how the flow goes,
Mm-hmm.
for most of the examples I could think of. And then from there, I think for me, like a lot of the initial design process is just like a blank Word document on the computer
Yeah.
or a Google Doc, and it's just writing down the general, most like top level basic ideas, not in any particular order. It's just like bullet points of here are all the ideas I have,
Mm-hmm.
and then later it's trying to kind of organize those into something that makes sense.
Right.
Is that similar for you that you just kind of
Oh yeah,
start with
I
the
have
page?
dozens and dozens of documents, of Word documents, at various degrees of being filled out. On my portable hard drive, on my computer, on my phone, because I use Evernote on my phone, so my phone has tons of them. Where it's like I'll be at work and I'll be like on break or something. I'm like, oh, I have an idea, and I'll just start really quick writing down some stuff. And I would say maybe like 2% of those ever get further than just that state. But it
Sure.
helps to be able to take those ideas and put them somewhere. So then eventually I can either go back to them later, or even just writing them down kind of helps me think about them away. Like if it exists only in my head, it's very easy to only see like my ideal version of it. But even just writing it down, you're usually then able to go like, oh wait, no, I didn't think about it this way. It doesn't work like this, or I'd have to change some things or whatever. So
Yeah, and I wonder if kind of the shape of those notes looks differently for you as you often design like RPGs,
hmm.
RPG systems. For me, like it's no surprise that the main thing I often design ideas for is cooperative card games. Like that's kind of my jam. That's
Yeah.
why I'm so not. But so for me, it's often like the first things I note down is like, okay, how do you win the game?
Hmm.
Like kind of the important part, the win conditions. And then since I'm often designing card games, one of the first things I often write down is like, what are the different card types that are going to be in the game?
Yep.
Because that usually orients everything from there of like what the mechanics might be.
Yeah.
Um, and then from there, I often, it kind of seems like a weird jump from there, but I often just think about like mocking up an example
Oh
card for
yeah.
each of the card types just to get an idea for like as you do that, then you're like, okay, it probably needs like a resource cost, it probably needs, this and that. Like it kind of
Hmm.
gives you an idea from there.
I
But are there
totally.
any
I was just
key
gonna say
parts for
I'm
you?
totally the same way. Where my goal is that if I feel really good about an idea or a design, yeah, an idea, then my goal is to then get it as close to prototype as possible. And when I say prototype, I don't mean like go to a designer and you go, here's my prototype, what do you think? Or a publisher rather, but more like get it on the table for me physically and actually try and there's and actually try and play it, like see what it looks like to actually play. And usually, even if it's a multiplayer game, it's still just me at the table at that point. Like I don't include anyone else because it's so raw and so bare bones, that I literally just want to see what it looks like at that moment. So then I have a little bit more to go on, and then I tend to bounce back and forth between like try it on the table for a little bit, maybe get like I don't know a good hour into like testing on the table, and then go back to just the Word doc, change things, go back to the table with those changes, and vice versa.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I often feel that way too, that it's
Hmm.
like it's it's a weird kind of balancing act because it's not that you fully flesh out everything before you start testing out some of the parts. Like you would
Right.
think that's the way it works, but often for me it's like I flesh out kind of a rough idea, but then I actually start trying to design like the bare bones that I can test with just to get an idea for does this even work, and then go back from there.
Hmm.
What I've heard different designers talk about this next question, so I'm curious how you approach it. Like, at what point do you start writing like the actually fully fleshed out rules?
I actually start that pretty early, because once I have an idea for what it looks like and what it feels like on the table, then like I said, I'm very goal oriented. So my first goal is to get that prototype on the table, get the bare minimum I need on a document to get it on the table. Then once I have that done, then my next goal is, are these bare bones fun? Like, is it fun? And if it is,
Hmm.
then my goal after that is get it in front of other people, like with me explaining it to them. But I'm very much of the mindset where I will look at, like, and RPGs are a good example for this. So even when I'm just typing up my notes for an RPG, I format it and I set everything up so that it looks not official, but like it's one step away from official, like as official as I can get it to look, because that just
Hmm.
in my brain, then that's my head going, okay, you're making progress on this. Like, it's not like all you have to do now that you have the formatting set is just fill the blanks in. So I tend to do that pretty early in the process.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat as you that I tend to start writing the rules pretty early. So it's almost like if you like the first there's like kind of initial brainstorm
Hmm.
stage, and then there's a stage where I kind of design a few mock-ups to try out some ideas. And then the third stage for me is okay, write out the rule book.
Yeah.
It's not going to have the clever formatting it might have later, but it's just it'll have the sections and kind of list all those out.
Hmm. And
Because I think
that's
in thinking that out, that's how you develop a lot of the mechanics anyway. Like you have to
yeah.
address all those parts of it.
Well, and not only that, but it's also helpful to grab a rule book of a similar game
Mm.
and just look at it and be like, what am I missing? Like, what have these
Hmm.
guys? And also to then look at that rule book and go, what do they not have that I want to make sure I highlight in my rules?
Right.
Yeah. And then to go back to. Now I lost it.
It's
It'll probably
gone.
come up later. But much like designing a game, there's ideas going all over the place, and I can only hang on to one at a time.
There was one question or kind of comment in chat that the genre called Euro games typically designs mechanics first. Or yeah, there was a question: do European game designers, Euro game designers, kind of do the opposite mechanics first? I don't know. I don't know a ton of
Yeah.
designers personally. That's always been my understanding, but I don't know if that's just a stereotype or that's actually what happens.
I
But
can say that, like, the one time I tried to design a Euro game, I still went theme first. Like, I still had an idea
hmm.
for, and this is big for me, is what do I want it to look like when it's on the table? And that
Hmm.
includes like color scheme and visual design,
Hmm.
even though that, like, if you're gonna present it to a publisher, you need to be open and willing to having that be changed, like changed wholesale even. But that's still something that is really important to me because I really like games to just like pop off the table. I like them to be
Yes.
not necessarily colorful, but I like them to be very appealing. Like if you're walking by a table and it's set up, I want people to be like, "Ooh, what does that look like?" So often
Hmm.
that is all rolled in with theme and then the broad mechanics as to the level. But as far as what Euro game designers do, I can't really speak to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I don't know what category this falls in, but I know a general approach I have to designing games when we're talking about like the initial stages and making rules is that I often dump all my ideas into it,
Yeah.
and not really censor at that point. Like the playtesting process and revision process for me is like 90% cutting things. I feel like, and how I get to what I feel is a good game is usually cutting mechanics out because I usually start with something pretty complex and lots of rules because I'm throwing
Hmm.
in all my fun ideas. But then I kind of have to rein myself in because usually that doesn't make a good game. Like a good
Right.
game is usually more focused
Yeah.
and is really focused on the key mechanics. Since we're talking about Euro games and kind of that question, we had a question in chat. To what extent do you balance random chance versus skill in your game design? Like dice, tokens, the example of finding Jazz Mulligan and then counter deck. And does it depend on the game? So, what are your thoughts on kind of balancing chance versus skill?
I like to have a healthy dose of both, and I think that probably part of one of the things I'm trying to work on as a game designer is to lean more into skill and less into chance.
Mm.
But I still like to have chance there. Again, Euro games are really fun, and like Lords of Waterdeep and Dinogenics are two amazing Euro games that I really love that have very little on the chance just by design. And they're great. But I know that for me and the type of games that I love rolling dice, and I love that moment of like tension that comes from when the dice leave your hand to when they hit the table and stop
Hmm.
rolling. Like I really love that. I love flipping cards over, like the act of like drawing an encounter card and going, I don't know what this is gonna be. Like, oh my gosh, am I prepared for it? Like I think that's really I love those emotional reactions, and so I do try and capitalize on those when it comes to chance. But I notice that sometimes I rely on those too heavily as a designer, so I'm trying to incorporate more skill focused design elements into my games.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and
Hmm.
I'm gonna give the answer to that I try to do a balance, even though that might be a boring answer, but I mean it's the truth. It's like that's really what you have to balance between, especially I think like the kind of games we both like designing.
Hmm.
But the import, like both of those are so important to me, and I don't like shortchanging either one because the the skill element is what brings people back into a game and
Hmm.
and what makes people do podcasts about a game and what makes people join discords for a game and want to join a community because they want to talk about how to get better and
Yeah.
judge cards together. And so that like without that skill piece, and if you don't feel like you can get better at the game or improve, then that motivation isn't there. And
Hmm.
I don't feel like people really want to come back to the game.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like the reason I'm not necessarily a huge fan of just eliminate all random factors as much as possible
Right.
is because so much of the flavor of game, like the moments I remember, like just taking Arkham as an example, are times when yeah maybe the encounter deck is screwing you and
Yeah.
really giving you bad cards, and it's just a succession of bad events that if you did the probability maybe it's a lower probability, and so you could say chance is really screwing you, but then the fact you're able to come back and still win in that example is what
Hmm.
makes it so meaningful. So like if you drain too much of the chance out of it, you remove too much of the variance that every session of that same game starts feeling too sameish, feels
Hmm.
too similar, especially in a solo or competitive game. Like
Yeah.
you have to have that variance in it to really create those memorable moments, I think.
Yeah. Totally. Um, and another question from chat regarding solo games. What are your thoughts regarding how to represent the opponent, such as an
Hmm.
adversary deck, or adapting a PvP by automating the actions for a player, such as with Scythe? It's easy, and I use this word loosely, but it's easy for me to fall back on the idea of there is a deck of cards that represents, because most of the games that I play that
Hmm.
are solo or that are cooperative like that rely on a deck of cards over anything else. I think there's a lot more, like Scythe is brought up in the question. That's a great example. There are other games that handle that sort of automation without using just strictly a deck of cards. But a deck of cards is one of the easiest way, at least for me, to wrap my head around like what's the best way to make it challenging and
Hmm.
also random to an extent. So
Yeah, and I agree. And because like two of my big games have been Lord of the Rings LCG and then Arkham Horror LCG, and that whole model of like encounter deck, like it's so
mm-hmm.
ingrained in my brain that I think most of my recent games have used that model. I'm trying to think um if I've broken out of that. I
Sure.
think one of the recent games I've designed is kind of a melding of that encounter deck model with kind of the action modeling, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's using a deck of cards to drive things, but then it's also kind of structuring the enemy turn so that it's taking a turn as the player would almost, but then it's
Right.
using those cards to determine what it does. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I don't know. I think there's room to explore there in other games, but um, I'm not sure. I see this comment in chat about a talk that Richard Garfield gave about how much we call skill versus luck flips when you consider metagame factors. That's true, and that's often something I think when people often criticize, let's say Arkham Horror LCG for being too luck based
Mm.
or too dependent on the chaos bag. And my response is always like the whole game is based around mitigating that factor,
Yeah.
like
Mm-hmm.
almost everything. So yeah, it's not always a clean delineation.
No. Mm-mm.
Um, so what are your thoughts on, say, balancing a game's difficulty? Like both, I guess both balancing and scaling. So how do you go about balancing the difficulty? What do you think is the sweet spot for the game's difficulty? And then also how do you scale for like different player counts?
So regarding difficulty, that's something that really changes for me based on the game that I'm actually designing, and particularly the theme that I'm going for. If it's assuming it's cooperative, then I generally try to err on the side of difficulty. Like I try to make things a little bit more difficult than I would otherwise, simply because I think it's better to lean difficult and then ease up through testing than it is to it feels worse to go easier at first and then ramp it up through testing, in my opinion.
Hmm.
I like to kind of hit hard early and then after a couple tests be like, okay, that was impossible. What can I do to make it at least feel possible? And like, then is it actually possible? That sort of thing. So I tend to lean more difficult. I want to feel like every turn, and this is very general because obviously turn structure and all that's going to change from game to game, but I want it to feel like every turn I'm able to make progress towards something, whether that's to complete
Hmm.
like achieving my objective in the game, or to setting up my board state, or to, if it's an engine builder, like getting more components like working or in play. I want to feel like regardless of what the situation is, the scenario or the game itself isn't so difficult that it's locking me out of everything, because that's when I really feel like I'm not enjoying the time, is when I'm like, well, why am I even playing? Like, I can't play anything. I can't do anything. What's the point? So I like to make sure that you still feel like you're able to make progress every time. And whether that means tweaking like scenario or game, like in the case of Arkham, tweaking the encounter deck to not be as limiting, or to maybe focus on one type of action instead of punishing you for all of them, or if that means redesigning things that are boons to the player. Like you have multiple knobs that you can kind of turn and adjust as you go. But yeah, start hard, make it a little bit easier, and then still always give the players a chance to feel like they're going to progress in something.
Yeah, I think I generally have that same approach too, kind
Mm.
of tending towards the hard because you don't want it to be easy in a cooperative game, which doesn't feel very fulfilling. But I think you hit on something, that there's kind of different types of difficulty or difficulty experiences for players.
Hmm.
Um, because I guess it's really about avoiding the kind of NPE, negative player experiences for
Yeah.
me, and that like if you have components of your game or your encounter deck or whatever it is that it's constantly shutting off what players can do, like that's fine in small amounts or here and
Hmm.
there. But it really, you want players to feel like they still have agency to try to address that. Like your job is to give them problems to solve,
Right.
and make it harder to solve those problems. But if you're basically taking that agency away so they feel like they can't even make progress towards solving those problems, then it doesn't feel good.
Hmm.
Um, and I know in a recent game, similarly, like it started out dice based and I changed it, because there were a lot of elements where the dice would just keep missing, which is fine. I like some dice based games, but I wanted to change it more so that no matter what you're doing, you might be able to make a progress in some regard, even if it's not all the progress you want to make with
Hmm.
a certain action.
Right.
So it's just, yeah, it's just kind of tweaking those levers, like you said, to with always that kind of goal in mind.
Yeah.
Um,
And I do think that if you're designing a game or a scenario or whatever, I think the biggest thing for you to look at is, are there interesting choices for the players to make? I
mhm.
think that's probably the biggest piece. Like when I think about a game design, that's my primary thing about the mechanics, is like, do they feel like they have a choice? Are those choices relatively equally weighted? Because the more equal they are in weight, the harder that choice will be for the player. And that's where I think you get more engaging gameplay, is when it's not like, well, obviously I would do this every turn because that's
Mhm.
obviously the best thing. Like, no, you want to make sure that you're giving the player multiple things to do, and that at least two of those are pretty equal in obvious reward or obvious progress. So, and that kind of goes to that whole difficulty thing. Like, if you're going to limit the number of choices, or you're going to hamper their ability to resolve those choices, then you want to make sure that if they do end up resolving them, those choices are still going to have a significant impact in the course of the game. So,
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like it's, you can almost think of scenario design and game design as a series of providing choices for players
mm-hmm.
ultimately, like you said. And providing meaningful, like every or most choices at least should have some kind of weight to whatever choice they can make,
Hmm.
and that it has to be a hard decision a lot of times, because that's what makes it a game, is that you have to make that decision as a human of which choice to make. I almost think about it in a totally different kind of venue, in video games. Like, I remember when I first played the Dragon Age Origins
Oh, sure.
game, and I thought it was very cool that they had lots of like choices you had to make as a player, of like which faction you should support, or
Hmm.
which choice you should make. But usually each kind of choice you make would have a disadvantage to it. There weren't a lot of clean cut choices,
Yep.
and that's kind of what I think of in terms of the game design too.
Hmm.
Um, so let's move into art designing Arkham scenarios specifically,
Sure.
and kind of uh how we go about designing those, and maybe how that differs, if any, from what we've talked about so far. I did want to hit on one question because it was further back before we forget.
Hmm.
Um, how far along the design process for your work and with Matt and Caleb were you when they were involved? Was it pitching them a nearly finished product or a collaborative?
In my case with Excelsior, Matt actually approached me. And he said, and that's why I've had some people ask me, like, how can I design an official Arkham scenario? And I was like, well, I'm like, the key there, I think, is to design custom scenarios that you're confident in and that you're happy sharing with other people and that people tend to like. And also do it at a time when FFG happens to be looking for extra designer, like freelance designers. Like I was
Hmm.
really, mine, how I got that was in part because of the work I did on my Winter Winds campaign, and Matt saw that and liked it, and also just the timing of it and the fact that they had the opportunity to hire freelancers, and so then Matt reached out to me. So Matt was involved with me pretty early on because he said, "How would you like to design a scenario?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay, you pitch me some ideas." I pitched him one, and he loved it, so that's what we went with. From there, there was an almost, I would say, almost a weekly back and forth between Matt and I. I pretty much gave him like the game design document, the overarching ideas. Like this is what I want to do. This is how I expect to do it. This is how I plan to stay within the card limit set by FFG. And he's like, okay, cool. And then I would make the prototype. I'd try it. I'd tweak it. And after like 2 or 3 play tests of it, then I would send him like what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, and we kind of go back and forth. So I really lucked out with Matt because he and I are friends anyway outside of this relationship. So
Hmm.
it was really easy for me to communicate with him on the regular and be able to share ideas with him, and then he would share ideas back. So I would say I didn't really include him at any certain point. It was more just I did a pretty significant portion of the design, and then when I got stuck, I would throw it at him. Or when I had
Hmm.
crazy ideas to put in too much stuff, like I usually do, I would toss it at him and be like, "What do you cut? What do we get rid of?" That sort of thing. So he was there pretty much throughout the whole process. How
Cool.
about Caleb with you?
So yeah, it was similar in that Caleb approached me because he needed someone to help out with these particular scenarios, these kits. Since he was working on a bunch of stuff, he's always working on a bunch of stuff for FFG. So of course I was more than willing to do that. And me having known Caleb for a while and having done a lot of playtesting for Lord of the Rings for many years, so I jumped in there. He had already created some of the card ideas, and then from there, I was basically filling in the gaps, just generating a bunch of card ideas and kind of general ideas for the scenario.
Hmm.
And then so that's kind of the point at which I came into the process. And then once I had all that worked out, then it was really the process of Caleb, since they have their whole playtesting system over there and playtest groups. Then he took what I created and did a bunch of playtesting, um, with those groups, and then refined it there,
Hmm.
with kind of my feedback. So, yeah, that's kind of the point in the process where I came in. Um, so, is there anything when you're designing an Arkham scenario that you think is special or different from your general kind of game design approach?
Well, it's more right off the bat. It's more focused, simply because the bones are already there, and even more
Hmm.
than the bones are there. There's also bits of meat that you can pull from existing scenarios, things you like. So like I often think of map first. A lot of the things I design tend to be like exploration, large map dependent, that sort of thing. A lot of backtracking. And so I think about like, okay, what is the map going to look like? How can I arrange this map? My general hard limit on locations is like 12. And I'm like, if I
Mhm.
get to 12 locations, that's usually going to be approaching too big. And then I'm like, all right, can I get it down to 10? Like, but if I need to go to 12, I will, that sort of thing.
Sure.
Because I like big maps and I like kind of
Yeah.
I like the presence that demands at the table. But other than that, I try not to design for specific player cards because I think that's a trap. I think it's very easy to go, well, this particular card is really, really good. How do I make a scenario that won't this card won't like trivialize a scenario? And I think that's like I said, that's an easy trap to fall into because there's so many times if you have the mind of a game designer when you're playing cards, you might play a player card and you might go, this is too strong. Like, why aren't they tabooing this? This is insane, And then so then if you try
Mhm.
to go to it on the other side of the map or on the other side of the screen rather, you're like, well, I already know Mr. Rook is really good, so how can I punish the players for using Mr. Rook? I think you're getting into game design for the wrong ideas there. So I tend to avoid worrying about player card interaction. But
Mhm.
if you can find, this is another thing that I do with Arkham, if you can find those fun little moments to where you're like, okay, what does flashlight do? That reduces shroud at a location. Well, maybe then if I'm using darkness in this scenario, maybe that can do something that flashlight is a hard counter to
Mhm.
without actually writing, like, if they have flashlight, discard this card. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
Yeah.
there's also those fun little interactions that you can really look for, and I think that's where I have the most fun with designing for Arkham is finding how to capitalize on those interactions.
Yeah, I think we both share the love of big maps for sure.
They're fun.
Because locations are such a fun part of Arkham. I mean,
Yeah.
it's what makes it so distinctive as a game. It's just that sense of place and the fun things you can do with locations is such a big part. For me, I think when designing Arkham scenarios, I usually start. I mean, I'll probably have some kind of other basic ideas for general mechanics and kind of
Mm-hmm.
effects, but in terms of actually sitting down and like filling out a spreadsheet of cards, usually where I start is the act and agendas,
Yep.
because that's like the it's almost like the plot structure of a book. So
Mm-hmm.
once you figure those out, you know kind of the flow of the scenario, and then from there it's figuring out what are the enemies going to be, the locations, its treacheries, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I usually go act and agenda, then design all the locations, and then kind of the enemies and treacheries are like the last part of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the nice thing too with Arkham is that a lot of that design, like once you have the working like premise of a scenario. Like you have the basic idea of where you're going, what you're doing, and that sort of thing. A lot of the mid to later testing just comes down to tweaking numbers and like
Mm-hmm.
we need one more doom on this threshold, but one fewer doom on the next threshold, or there's too many clues on this location and it's a required location, or there's this many clues total in the map, so that's how many clues we have to play with as far as requirements for the act and maybe enemy abilities that eat clues and stuff like that. So it really then, like that mid to late testing phases is just all about tweaking numbers to get it to that feeling that you want it to be at, which I think is pretty easy.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where you want to be during playtesting. Like once
Mm-hmm.
I get to the point where it's just tweaking numbers, I'm happy. Like because the first playtest, whether it's an Arkham scenario or a game in general, is like the fun test. Like
Mm-hmm.
is this game or scenario fun? Am I having fun? Is it too frustrating? Um, and that's really the tough part because
Yeah.
those are the parts you really want to tweak. And that's when you're doing really big changes sometimes, because if something just totally doesn't work, it's usually pretty obvious right away.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, once you get to those kind of mid to late play tests where it's, oh, let me just tweak the numbers on this, then I start feeling okay. As
Yeah.
long as I'm confident that the overall design it works, then
Right.
that's good. um had a question up here for Nick, I think it was. Where was it? In terms of difficulty for Arkham scenarios specifically, it seems like Nick, how do you judge the Doom clock on Excelsior? Was it just playtesting, or was it a number-based exercise, actions needed versus time allowed?
It was definitely more play testing, and if I think you're referring primarily to the big second act in Excelsior that has like a 12
Probably.
Doom threshold.
Hmm.
Like we knew a couple things going into that. There's spoilers for Excelsior here, by the way. Matt and I knew a couple things. One was that flipping that agenda would end the game. Like the investigators would lose, and there would be, because we had set up enemies that like utilize Doom, like with the police and with the guests, the hotel guests. We knew that had to be high, so I just set it at 10 and tried that. And some games it worked if I was playing a really fast investigator, if I was playing someone who condensed a lot of actions or grabbed clues really quickly. Rex often had very little trouble with that middle agenda, again depending on my token pulls and all that, obviously. But I really just play tested it out, and then eventually was like, 10 works under some circumstances, but not most. And I want it to work under most, like that 55 to 60% of the time. I want you to get past that. So then all I did was just bump it up to 12, and I think I only play tested it at 12 a couple times, and I felt pretty confident with it. And I should also say that for that particular scenario, most of the playtesting, especially in the later phases, happened with Matt and the FFG playtesters.
Right.
I did some of my own playtesting, obviously, but as it got longer, like as the development got longer in the process, that became less and less because he had more playtesters who were seeing it closer to a finished product, and so I was happier just kind of letting them do most of the testing for me, and me to just kind of tidy up behind them, essentially. So, but yeah, it was a playtesting thing. I didn't look at the math and equations of it at all. I didn't.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's been similar for me in Arkham scenarios that I've designed. It's kind of a gut feeling informed by experience of for the Doom clocks,
Mm-hmm.
specifically on agendas. Just this feels like a 3
Yeah.
agenda
Yeah.
based on what you have to do, and then yeah, it's really playtesting to figure out whether that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes it might be like, this is kind of like this other agenda in a different scenario. So what kind of Doom threshold did they use on this one? And that might be a guide
Right,
sometimes.
exactly. And also too, and this is according to Matt, and this was back when we talked about it, so this would have been back
Hmm.
in like what, TFA, early TFA days. Or actually probably Lake Carcosa. Anyway, he had said that the average Arkham scenario, like the average difficulty, is 2 per investigator clues and 4 Doom. Like that's your
Right.
average. And so when you know that, like once he told me that, that kind of solved it for me, because I think I had it at 3 per investigator for the first act
Hmm.
and that sort of thing. So once you have an idea for like that's what your average investigator should be expected to handle, then you can tweak it accordingly to get to the
Right.
difficulty level you want. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. Definitely. Another question in chat. How do you feel about story assets that take up slots, potentially kicking out allies or weapons or what have you?
I'm
Um,
fine with it. Like,
yeah, I'm generally fine with it.
hmm
I'm trying to think about a time when I wouldn't be. Yeah, I think unless it was like Overboard, where you were getting like 5 assets and they're
yeah,
each taking
yeah.
up a different slot. But generally, how I've seen it is it's like one key ally in a scenario that kicks them out, or
The only time that
um,
I ever felt it was too much was for Winter Winds, the second scenario, and I think they're still like this. I think I never went back and fixed it, but you have the option to dig through rubble at the
hmm,
beginning of the scenario to find useful items, and that costs you much needed time because you're losing daylight. And so if you did that, I think 3 of those items used slots. So if you had spent time setting up your board and then you're like, well, I'm in a good spot now. Now I'll look for items. Oh shoot, this map kicked out my gun, like that sort of thing. I didn't like that because that was an optional thing the players could choose to do, and players often
hmm,
didn't choose to do it until they were already set up and felt good about their board state. So I felt like I was punishing them for engaging in that part of the scenario. So that is a hope, or an expectation rather, to go back and change that so that those don't take up slots. But yeah, if it's like an ally, or if it's one thing that the scenario just happens to give you, especially right away, have it take up a slot. I don't see a problem with it.
yeah, and I think you'll see if you look at different scenarios that not all story assets do it. Like say Jazz Mulligan or
Mm-hmm.
Doctor Shivani and Waking Nightmare. Like those are they're people that that are with you, but they don't take up the ally slot.
Yeah.
Versus, I'm trying to think of someone who does. I think Randolph Carter and Waking Nightmare, for example, takes up the ally slot. So I think they don't always need those slots, but it's just judging, like, is this kind of a card that you're giving players that's gonna have kind of a big impact on their board state, and then maybe it should have a slot.
Well, and also, is it a card that the players will be able to take with them out of the scenario?
Right.
Because if that happens, then you definitely want to make sure it is using the same slots that other similar cards in the player pool use. Because if it isn't, then it's going to be super powerful. So if you have an ally that doesn't use an ally slot and they can win it at the end of the scenario, like, ooh boy, I would really think about changing that.
Yeah, for sure. Another question in chat: is there a risk that you become too familiar with your own scenario and find it hard to judge difficulty? Absolutely, for sure.
Yes.
That's why playtesting is so key. Even with my first stage scenarios, I mean, that's low stake stuff because it's just fan made scenarios. Like, no one's gonna fire me if it sucks.
Right.
But even for those, like, I recruited like a group of 6 or 7 playtesters that would playtest those scenarios, and I went through like a whole playtesting cycle as if it was an actual product because it's so important. And all of my cycles would probably, I mean, all of my scenarios would be crap without that playtesting, probably, because it's so important. Like, you just can't see everything in your own work. You just can't. Like,
exactly.
You need playtesters you need other sets of eyes. They will think of things you didn't think of. They will think of interactions you didn't think of, and yeah, they absolutely will be able to judge the difficulty. I mean, usually, all that being said, my first few playtests are usually just myself, and of course you can usually tell if it's obviously too hard or too easy, but beyond that, yeah, you need the playtesting.
Yeah, Excelsior was interesting for that because a decent part of the challenge about the middle of that scenario is learning which items connect to which locations in the hotel. And I won't say a decent part of the challenge because that's not true, but in my opinion, the most interesting part of that part of the scenario is deducing where these items go to. And of course I knew, like, every single time, like, regardless of where that scenario was in playtesting, I knew exactly where they went because I designed them. And so I think that contributed more to why I stopped testing as much as it went on, was simply because once I started to feel good about the difficulty and feel good about the pacing and everything, then, like, that was the information I was looking to learn from playtesting. The rest of the information, as far as, like, it doesn't make, like, why would this item go here or that sort of thing, like, that's nothing that I could, or rather, this is too hard because we couldn't figure out where to go. That's nothing that I could ever hope to learn, no matter how many times I playtest, because I always know, you know what I mean? So, yeah, I definitely think that it is very easy to become too familiar with it, and in some cases, just designing it, just the act of creating it is already meaning you're too familiar with the design, and you need to seek help elsewhere, so...
Yeah, because even, like, if you think about just official Arkham scenarios that we all play as players, like, you just get better at a scenario the more you play it. You figure out the right strategy, the optimal path through locations. And so, yeah, like, when we were designing Constellation and I had done the first few playtests, after a while I had gotten used to, like, these are the things you have to do in the scenario, these are the routes you take, and then at that point, then it becomes hard. You need other people to get that kind of inexperienced point of view, so they can truly judge the difficulty if you don't know the optimal path.
Yeah,
it's
totally.
an important thing. Let's see, other questions. Okay. Speaking of playtesting, how many times do you end up playtesting a scenario? Do you get sick of it?
There's no limit, there's no goal for number of playtests. It's until it feels right, or until I'm done, again, with, like, Excelsior, or, like, especially if it's an RPG scenario, until I run out of people to playtest with who don't know it. And do you end up getting sick of it? Yeah. I mean, sometimes you do, and that's just part of the truth of being exposed to it as often and as frequently, is, like, yeah, eventually the fact that there's nothing new to discover is sometimes going to turn it into the fact that you're like, I don't want to touch it for a week or two. And honestly, that time off, like taking a week or two away from a project and then coming back to it, that can work wonders, because then you're in a different headspace. You're coming to it kind of from a fresh start. and so you start to see things differently or whatever. But yeah, no, I think it's definitely easy to get too familiar with a project and then thus feel like you're just not going anywhere, or like you're just kind of getting sick of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the similar. I'm not sure about the number of times question. It just varies based on
Mm.
like how well designed it was to start, how many changes you have to
Yeah,
make, and all that. But
there's
usually
that
it's a
too.
lot, and definitely get sick of it after a while. And
Mm.
that's often why I don't play my scenarios often after they've been designed and are out there because I've played them so many times. But usually it's a good sign if I do want to play them afterwards. Then
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, that's a good sign that I actually still get fun out of it.
Hmm.
For playtesting, do you create new decks or do you fall back on pre-built ones?
I usually start with my old reliables for playtesting. Honestly, what I usually do is I usually play with the decks that are currently in campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
Because then I usually have a few that are at different levels of experience. And because they're in campaigns that are running concurrently, they often explore different areas of the player card pool. So I might have one that's all, or mostly Guardian, one that's mostly Rogue, and one that's mostly Seeker. That's a good spread of player cards and abilities and strengths and weaknesses to get a decent idea, at least early on in the playtesting. And then as I go, like once I start to see either holes in the design or potentially exploitable areas or stuff like that, then I'll go like, okay, now I'm going to build a deck to break this scenario. Now I'm like
Right.
with Excelsior, it was now I'm going to build a Rex deck that is all
Mm-hmm.
about getting like 4+ clues in one turn or 5+ clues in one turn or whatever. I want to try and break this. That I tend to only do a few times, simply because then I usually get enough information about the general pacing or the difficulty of a scenario to where I can then tweak accordingly. And again, I don't like to design for specific player cards because I think that's kind of lame. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to shut out, like if that Rex deck proved to be too good, I then didn't want to make Excelsior shut down Rex completely because that wouldn't be fun. So yeah, I tend to start with my existing decks, the ones that I have built already, and then I go, okay, let's make this scenario my bitch. So
Yeah, I think similarly, I have a range of decks that I use, and the unfortunate reality is you can't playtest every type of deck. There's just not enough time in the day, unless even if you're. I was gonna say unless you're doing this full time for a job, but even then you probably don't have enough time because there's so many
yeah.
deck types in the game now. So yeah, it's really just trying to get a sample. So I'll usually have like a Guardian and Seeker duo because that's usually a pretty strong OP combo to check.
Mm,
Okay, is this too easy with a really strong deck? Because you want it to be somewhat of a challenge even for that combo.
right.
But then I'll have a little bit less of a tuned deck to see kind of for an average set of decks.
Hmm.
But then especially when I'm testing solo, I'm trying to test like can a Seeker kind of not combat focused decks can they still do some of the key things to make the scenario happen? Are they
Hmm.
going to get trapped up somehow? That doesn't mean the balance should be like equal between classes though. Like
Right.
if a scenario is really hard for a Seeker compared to a Guardian, that's fine. That's just Arkham life.
Hmm.
But it's more about like is it possible? To give an example, like in Constellation, there's a Treachery, the Sealed Doors,
Mm.
where you have to do a combat test. But obviously, if you're playing a solo, like one combat investigator, like how the heck are you ever going to pass that test?
Right.
So then I had to build in the other clause that you can just take damage to get out of it, which
Hmm.
also sucks if you're a weaker investigator in terms of physical stats, but at least you have a way to get out. So
Right.
trying to avoid those MPEs. We're going to move over in a second to actually designing or spitballing an Arkham scenario, but I wanted to touch some of these questions. Where was this one? Do you design for standard difficulty first and then just tweak the token counts? That's the easy one for me. Yes, I designed standard difficulty first and then I kind of tweak the other elements.
Yeah, I definitely do that too. That's the beauty of the Chaos Bag is that it's so easy. It's so easy to make tiny changes that have pretty decent effects. So yeah, designing
Mm-hmm.
for standard is the best case, and then with hard or whatever, all you have to do is just be like, all right, well, let's turn this -3 into a -5. So
Right. Yeah. And usually the hard is like, instead of it being an if you fail, it usually does it automatically to you, for example.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Last question on this segment. Did any of you come up with an idea that you just couldn't get to fit into the mechanics, no matter how hard you tried, but you still feel was a stellar idea?
Ooh, I feel like I have thousands of examples for that, but I can't pull one right now. But that sort of thing happens because I'm a crazy idea guy. First and foremost, like I'm always like, ooh, wouldn't it be awesome if this? And then if I'm designing with someone like with Matt, or with like some of my RPG stuff, I do a lot of work with Casey. They're just like, well, how do we do that? And I'm like, I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
let's figure it out. I you know, I'm reticent to talk about this because it's about a future scenario that I had planned for Winter Winds, and I see someone's bringing up any news on part 4 of Winter Winds, and I don't know. Like I've been having so much trouble going back to that campaign, but there was one specific event that I was like, I'm putting this in, and that was a dog sled high speed descent down a mountain. Like that's gonna be in this game. I'm gonna come, whether it's a scenario or part of a larger scenario, it's gonna be in there. And every time I've gone to it, it's looked totally different than before, and I've never been happy with any iteration of it yet. So if maybe in the future, but yeah, that definitely happens. Come up with ideas that are so amazing, but just don't happen to work for what you're currently doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same with me. And kind of another facet of that, what also happens is I do come up with a mechanic for it, but I just end up having to cut it. Like I mentioned earlier, like I throw in the kitchen sink, but then you just can't be married to your ideas. Like no matter how much you love them, like it always has to be about what makes the best scenario or game at the end of the day. So you have to be willing to kill those ideas off and be like, I love this mechanic, but it doesn't quite fit in the game, or it distracts from the main things that are happening, and you
Right.
just got to leave it on the cutting room floor, and it's painful every time because you
Mm-hmm.
want to fit everything but you can't.
Yeah.
So yeah, unfortunately, that's just part of the game design approach. Okay, so let's transition to designing a scenario together. Obviously, we're not going to be able to design like individual cards. I mean, maybe we'll come up with a few card ideas, but really, this is coming up with some broad ideas of for an Arkham scenario. Little caveat: we make no promises that we will ever turn this into an actual scenario.
Yes.
I know. On Mythos Busters episode way back when, we had this nice cheeky discussion, as Sean would say, about designing a scenario, and we played it coy, and then ultimately we actually designed it. We make no promises that's going to happen this time. If it does, it does. But this is just a fun exercise for us and hopefully for you. So with that caveat out of the way, we do want some chat participation here to give us some ideas and kind of constrain our thinking here. So we've kind of thought about a few different elements that go into a scenario. So as we're thinking about designing a fresh scenario, and I don't have any ideas in mind, I went into this a blank page.
Same here.
So first, setting. Chat, throw out some setting ideas as far as where is this scenario going to be set.
So it can be broad or specific. You can be like I don't know, East Coast, or it can be like the basement of a mansion. Like
sure.
However specific or broad you want to be.
Yep. I think for Constellation, all I said was a cruise ship.
Yeah.
That was about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we will pick one and go from there. So we have Japan. That's broad. Secret government lab.
That's specific.
Always good.
In a single bedroom.
It's a single bedroom. You have the chair location, the bed location.
While you are exhausted on the bed location.
The location should just be different positions, like laying down, expanding.
Oh, that'd be great. A saucy puppet show. Ooh.
Antarctic Research Station. Speaking our language.
Yes, that.
Ooh, I like amusement park. That's pretty fun. Secret military installation. Father-in-law's birthday party.
Oh, these are silly.
Final challenge of the Triwizard Tournament.
Yeah.
uh,
Any of those standing out to you, Ian?
there's a few. I mean, shopping mall is always fun. Amusement park. Again, we talked about how we're suckers for big maps, so I'm thinking about fun locations. Airship is fun. Any of them that stick out to you?
Let's see here. Japan was the first one, and I was like, ooh, like that's interesting. We haven't had anything over there yet. Otherwise, yeah, I do like shopping mall just because I like all of the different possible interactions that could happen.
During a wedding.
during a wedding, that's interesting. Downtown New York, Midwest Ranch. Deserted Island is kind of cool too, because that'd be like trying to do more with less sort of thing. But yeah, shopping mall or amusement park. I like both of those personally.
Well, let's see. Are we gonna keep it period appropriate?
Oh yeah, because there wouldn't be a shopping mall.
Because there wouldn't really be a shopping mall per se.
Yeah.
Amusement park would be possible.
We could kind of like split the
fair,
difference and do like when was the first World's Fair? Like one of those sort of big events that's kind of like both. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like an exhibition thing. But that's not bar fight.
Island is a follow-up to Constellation. That's true.
Yeah. That's kind of fun. Well, we got to pick one. Supplies.
Oh, you're saying deserted island equals supplies. I know. Then we're getting forgotten vibes.
Bring back the explore mechanic. Let's just go with amusement park.
Okay, let's go with amusement park. That's our setting. So we have our settings set in place. Now, let's move on to the second component. So for chat, what's a mechanic you would want this scenario to explore? You can be as vague or broad as you want. Like for Constellation, we started off just saying that we wanted good chaos tokens, I think was like the starting place. So think about a mechanic you think might be interesting to explore.
For Excelsior, the like goal of the mechanics for me was that I wanted replayability, and I wanted the players to feel like they could deduce what to do next based on just the cards that they had. So that's where the leads came from. And like earlier in chat, someone said, I love how the flavor text of the leads could kind of point you in the direction. That was exactly what I wanted to do. So like, let's see. Chaos tokens. Yeah, nice, Scott. No, we're not doing that again.
Even better, yeah. Yeah, I think when I designed the Stranger Things scenario, I haven't mentioned that, but I designed a fan-made Stranger Things scenario. Yeah, the one thing mechanic I knew was going to be in there is going into the Upside Down, obviously, in some form. Credit rating.
A high score table. Interesting. That a high score table could fit with an amusement park.
Yeah, like different games you could play. It's almost like the locations in House Always Wins, but it could be a different take on that. Locations with weird effects like Hall of Mirrors that you can get lost in.
Need to get story asset people on your side. So it's a very very parlay heavy scenario, is what Scott's suggesting. I think that we can kind of combine big kahunas with SWXs, the locations with weird effects and the high score table. I think they both really fit like an amusement park sort of idea, and I think the high score table is really cool too. Like even if it was like you're putting tokens on a card and each player has to get so many, in order to trigger certain effects.
Agreed. Yeah. So let's go with some. It's kind of vague at this point, but basically mechanics focused on these locations that are. I guess the way I would frame it is the locations are providing like games in themselves.
Yeah.
Like game-like mechanics within locations. All right. So the next component, thank you, chat. The next component is the antagonistic force. So this could be an ancient one. This could be like a faction. But who are the baddies going to be in this scenario?
Think about the enemies that we're drawing off the deck. What do most of them? What are most of them looking like? Like, is it monsters? Is it people, cultists. We're getting a lot of clowns in chat.
Yeah, not surprising. Crazy clown cultists. Clowns. Yeah, Big Kahuna
Balloon
said,
animals. That's
one effect Big Kahuna said is eat a corn dog and do a might test or get ill.
oh, I love corn dogs, but that is true.
Greasy teens, balloon animals, security guards since you snuck in, sandworms,
Circus animals, zombies.
zombies.
I really liked the balloon animals, so that might be a little too much on the silly side. Like I just think that's hilarious. Like
Sentient balloon animals.
knives do +4 damage against them or something.
I mean, I think it makes sense for like the carnies, the carnival workers to be the antagonists. Like if this is kind of forming in my head that like the investigators go to this amusement park or carnival, and little do they know this is a big kind of like thing that the investigators are gonna have to find their way out of. And so like this high score table or a hall of mirrors, like you would think it's a fun carnival ride, but really these are the tests the investigators have to go through. Otherwise, these carnies are gonna kill them.
Slow Eye Joe says evil P.T. Barnum boss, and that actually I get really excited for the idea of like what the ringleader of this carnival would look like.
Right.
That's actually pretty cool. Okay.
Yep. So we got those elements. And then the last element is also kind of a general thing, but I kind of gave an idea for what the story might be, but feel free to throw in chat what are some story ideas you have of like why are we at this carnival? What do the carnies want? What are they looking to get? So just kind of what's the overall general of story if you were trying to give a elevator pitch for this scenario?
Another good way to think of it too, and this is kind of how I approach a lot of RPG scenarios, is think of a good verb that you want to kind of be like the main idea of the scenario. So like for consternation on the constellation, the one that I had posited originally was escape. Now obviously escape only then turned into just the first act of that scenario, but it grew into something else. And escape is a great verb because you know exactly what it means and what it's asking of you, and it gives a whole lot of ideas. Another good one would be like for Murder at the Excelsior, it was stop. It's learn what's happening at the Excelsior and stop it if you can. And even if you fail at stopping it, spoilers, you might be able to try again, just by the way that scenario is structured. So a good verb that is, it sets a clear tone and it gives you a very clear idea as to what to expect from the scenario and what the players are expected of. I'm seeing teeth in chat. Teeth is not a verb, unfortunately. You can't teeth something, but we could definitely work teeth into like a monster or something.
Yeah, we have hide.
Hide is cool. I kind of like that one, that you can't do anything against what's happening.
We have some story ideas here. Mysterious fair appears from town to town, setting up local chapters by converting townspeople. They are harvesting people and souls, kidnapping people to sacrifice. Scenario name Ride or Die. That's from Scott. Why am I not surprised?
Ride or die. Ride and die. It should be ride and die.
Yeah. Babies get teeth. They're hypnotizing people for bad things. Yeah, I think a lot of these story ideas are kind of coming from this similar angle of this carnival is trying to hypnotize or harvest people for some nefarious purpose.
Yeah, they're collecting people.
Yeah. All right, so we got our elements. Now we just got to design this thing.
Well, the map is it's both easy to think of stuff for the map, and it's also important based on this type of scenario, because this is like the location is pretty much the crux of everything. So like, what would you start with a map for an amusement park? I mean, obviously you'd pick out a couple rides. So things like Tilt-A-Whirl, Ferris wheel would be interesting. Wheel. Yep. House of Mirrors was brought up in chat. That would be great.
Yeah. I When I heard that, I almost thought that maybe that's kind of like the center of the carnival, almost
Mm.
like that's the final location where we have to confront the ringleader.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was thinking of those one things, the hammer where you hit it as hard as you can.
Oh, the little strength test. Yeah.
Yeah, the strength test.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so a
So
couple of the freak show, yeah.
another thing that came up too when we were talking about the high score idea was that another thing that you tend to think about, or at least I do, with Arkham scenarios is again variance and replayability.
Hmm.
And so while we were talking about the different locations could be the different games, the one thing that came to mind for me was like, what if there were like 5 treacheries that represented games, and you
Mm,
use maybe 3 of them per scenario or 4 of them per scenario, and you just attach them to different locations. Like there may be like 4
yeah,
locations across the map that each one has one attached to it. And
I
so
like
then
that.
the randomness is what games are coming up and also where are they located. And then that frees you up
Hmm.
to do other things with those locations potentially. So,
Yeah, yeah, I like that a lot.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, because then we can, yeah. Um, let's see what other location. Yeah, so a couple of rides, Carnival.
Concession stand. We got to have a freaky concession stand.
Gotta have the corn dogs for sure.
Yeah. I'm picturing like a human head hanging, behind the counter or whatever, like as something that you
Yeah,
can get. Something creepy like that.
merry-go-round.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, magic show.
It's been so long
And
since I've
chat.
been to an amusement park. I'm trying to
I
think.
know. I'm trying to think. Locations are various attractions arranged with each one on either side of a main path and a backstage location. They come out as the scenario advances. Yeah, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I like the idea of a main path. I like the idea of having like a central,
mhm.
like 2 central locations, and everything kind of branches off of that. Because that's easy to
Yeah,
track as a player too.
yeah. It's almost like when you're at a amusement park and you see the map, like when
Yeah,
you first enter and like that
exactly.
top-down view. Yeah, Archer Av in chat mentions the games also give players a starting objective before they find out there's something bad going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I that's the part I'm trying to figure out. Like, at what point do we start this story is always kind of a key consideration. So is the first agenda an act like the investigators just wandering around, maybe trying to figure out something before things really go bad? Um,
So I think I think we have to decide what the state of the carnival or the amusement
mhm.
park is when the investigators enter. Are they going during normal operating hours, and then we have enemies that represent regular, like amusement park attendees?
Mhm.
Very much again like what Excelsior did, or are they going? Are they maybe sneaking in after hours? And then that's like maybe the impetus to get them to play these games. Then is like even though it's after hours and there's apparently no one here, suddenly they walk by the strength test and it lights up and there's all this sound blaring and it's that sort of thing and it goads them into playing. And then eventually throughout the course of it, they would really. I think that might be more interesting than going during the day when people are there and attending and everything. Also, I think
Yeah.
that we would run the risk of having too many elements going at once because then you have to represent regular people in the map and how do they deal with everything and how does the antagonist deal with them. So,
Yeah, agreed. I think when I first pictured it in my mind, it was more of like an after hours
yeah,
thing.
same here.
Yeah. And so I think the games ultimately, in order for the players to want to do it, I mean, I would want to do it just for fun as a player, but to have an incentive, the games have to be tied into like the advancement somehow.
Yeah.
Um, so it could be they're initially going into this carnival to investigate something, insert reason here.
Hmm.
But then they have to complete a certain amount of these games to move forward.
Yeah. I like that like agenda 2 or rather act 2, sorry. So once they discover like the basis, like they get in or whatever, act 2 is then you'll like maybe you after you get a high score on one of the games, you get all the clues from that game's location and that's the only way you can get them. And
Hmm.
then once those clues are put on the act, which you can do at maybe one of the main paths or at a specific location, then you advance, and the whole goal is to do that before the agenda pops. Like I like that. I like that as a good chunky middle of this scenario is running around, getting those games, getting the clues, and then getting back to a central location. And maybe that central location then is where our our Act 3 opens up into. And that could be the House of Mirrors. Maybe that would add the House of Mirrors into play. Or maybe it would wipe the map and put like 3 new locations in play or 4 new locations or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I do like that as kind of in the middle, and then potentially the House of Mirrors is the finale. It could even be multiple locations for the House of Mirrors.
It could even be like
around.
a haunted house, and one of the locations in that is a Hall of Mirrors. That's just, it's easy to get into, but it's hard to get out of.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I do like that. Let's see, catching up on chat here. So the big bad is letting you play some carnival games for your souls. That's kind of how I'm picturing it. That the big bad is forcing you to play these games, and ultimately kind of luring you.
So it'd probably be like a little on the cheekier side, like I can see the flavor text being more fun, and like more. Well, Labyrinths of Lunacy wasn't exactly on the fun side, but it's more like the big bad is taunting you the whole time, and less like Guardians of the Abyss or something where it's more dire and grim and real. It's definitely more like he's like, oh, if you want to get out, you gotta do this, you gotta do these crazy games or whatever, And I like Archer Av's idea, where you use the high score theme to see how many clues you can pull off. So maybe the investigators only need half of the total clues, but each of those locations have victory points, So then if you can get a really high score and get all the clues off, then you get those victory points.
Yeah, and it could be that these games, like, to increase the tension of why they're having you play at, like, let's say you're doing the strength test. If you fail the strength test, that could be doing something bad to you, like penalizing your combat score or dealing damage or whatever the case may be. So either you succeed and are moving forward, or it's hurting you. Someone in chat mentioning that maybe the carnies are secretly actually the good guys and they're trying to stop something, but you don't find out until you interact, gain trust, less negative stereotyping, still uses insider outsider tension.
I actually really like that.
Yeah, I do like the idea that maybe even the games are actually, I mean, maybe they're not like straightforward good guys in the sense that they do everything in the proper way, but maybe they're using these games as a way to test whether the investigators are strong enough to defeat the real big bad,
Yeah, they're caught in the middle and they're just trying to find a way to free themselves, essentially. I like that. I like that a lot.
I like that too. So we kind of have the general structure of the quest and some ideas for treacheries. What do you think about enemies? Like, because when I think about enemies in a scenario, I think about, like, they're all going to have different effects, but usually they kind of play into a similar theme, whether it's cultists piling doom or like snakes poisoning you or trapping you up.
Yeah.
So what do we imagine for these? Like the carnies might start as enemies at least, so they would probably be the enemies in the deck. About what kind of effects they might have.
Well, if we're going with a relatively large map, then traversal is going to be a big part of it, and not even necessarily traversal, but just the fact that you're going back and forth between these locations. Well, I guess that is traversal. So traversal is a big thing of it, and also if you're playing games, like you're spending actions at these locations to do things that aren't investigate, but that still use tests. So I think that we definitely want enemies that chase. So we want hunters for sure, because it's a big map and players are moving around. And we also want enemies that guard specific games. And maybe we treat them, because I don't think it's as fun if you go, okay, if this big enemy that's chasing me gets up to me, I have to fight him. In order to play this game, I have to fight that guy. Like, you can do that. But I think it's more interesting if, like, the guard enemies are aloof, and they either force you to do something extra to interact with the game, or they penalize you further for failing. I think that's more interesting because then it's a choice
Yeah.
on the player's part to, do I spend the actions to engage with this aloof enemy and deal with them, or do I just try and brute force through it and complete the game? So I think those are the two basic, at least, kind of archetypes that we have to set up for our regular enemies.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too, is that they would make they'd add further consequences to the tests.
Mm,
So it's almost like Haunted and TCU, except for instead of like failed investigates, it's these failed game
right.
attempts, and they're hurting you more. So it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of that whippoorwill effect where do
Exactly.
you take the time to deal with it, or if you don't, you know it's going to come back
Yeah.
to bother you. And then usually there's kind of like a little putty enemy that's that's
Yeah. Your
kind of more
acolyte.
vanilla.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good old
In
putty.
chat, Huitzul says, taking your resources. And I actually really like that. Like, maybe one of these guard enemies is one where every time you fail a game, he takes a resource from you, or you lose a resource. And maybe if the games require you to spend a resource to do it, like, then that's like you're getting pinged double for failing. I like that. That's a
Yeah.
fun little theme.
Definitely. And so we only have a little bit of time left
Mm-hmm.
here. I'm trying to think of what that final showdown enemy would be like. Like, I mean, it doesn't have to be a big boss to end the scenario,
It
but if we're
doesn't.
thinking about it,
I
what would
really
that final challenge be? I guess is what I would say.
I think if it ends up going to a sub map like the haunted house, like if we end up wiping the map and putting a smaller
Hmm.
map in play, then we still, like, I think then the issue is, or not the issue, but navigating that map. There's probably something important to do at each location, especially if there's only four of them, or three or four locations. I love the idea of evil PT Barnum. Like, I love the idea of this super charismatic, super showy, bombastic villain at the center of it all. And I guess, and even if we didn't go with PT Barnum, like, if I were to design that type of enemy, he would probably have a bunch of, like, I might even copy something from, not copy, but I might even take an idea out of the Dark Souls board game where it's like he has a little stack of like 5 cards that in the
Hmm.
encounter phase the lead investigator doesn't draw from the regular deck, they draw from that, or whoever's at the location with them. And these are like special abilities that just cycle. So maybe there's like 3 cards and you do 1, 2, 3, and then you just flip the deck back over 1, 2, 3. So it's almost like he has a rotation of moves, and it could be pulling enemies out of the encounter discard pile, or it could be punishing you based on your score or stuff like that.
Hmm.
I think that's kind of a big departure from Arkham. So I don't know if I would commit to that, but that's at least where my head went just now.
Yeah, I do like that idea of instead of just being a straightforward fight, that it's really playing with the theatrics of it and
Mm-hmm.
like the trickiness of it.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing I was thinking when I was thinking Hall of Mirrors is somehow it would be playing with like turning your deck against you.
Oh,
But
that'd
then
be fun.
the next thing I thought after that is like I often take ideas from video games and other places when designing scenarios, but there's the Mario Rabbids Kingdoms battle that I've played with my son before, and there's this one enemy. He's like a singer character, so
Mm-hmm.
he's really feeds off attention. So there's these spotlights that are on them, and as long as those spotlights are on him, you can't damage him. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to like destroy the spotlights to get rid, so he doesn't have attention. So I'm thinking similarly, like this being whatever it is feeds off kind of people's attention or
Mm-hmm.
their involvement. So maybe once we get to this mini map, there are like people trapped there who have been trapped there
Yeah.
forever, and we have to free them from these different like attractions they're stuck in, and then only after that can you damage this enemy.
Yeah, I really like the idea that you want to have someone engaged with him to keep him busy, and you want other people to be
Hmm.
moving to the other locations to do these things like turn off spotlights and I don't know, like lock doors or whatever, like you
Hmm.
to basically limit his abilities. Like, I like that splitting the party, but then it becomes like, well, what do solo players do?
Yeah, that's
And I
always the question.
Yeah, that is the biggest question when designing. I'm surprised it hasn't come up before now, but yeah, solo players. That, like, how would you even account for that? But I don't think we're getting into the nitty gritty enough to really unlock that. But that would be a potential issue we'd have to address.
Yeah. Yeah, that is always a tricky, like scaling and designing for different player counts in
Hmm.
Arkham and Lord of the Rings LCG. Same thing is always tricky, especially that solo element. Like if there's only one person, how can they handle these kind of challenges? But it's
Hmm.
possible for sure. But you just
Hmm.
have to think a little creatively. But yeah, I like that kind of final showdown with this very theatrical
Yeah,
boss.
I would want it to shake up the regular flow of Arkham, because that's what this guy, in my opinion, would be all about. He'd be all about going like, "No, I'm gonna put on a show for you," you know. And
Hmm.
so then there's this fun like change in the regular flow of Arkham that is unique to this enemy in this encounter. And that is also just an interesting way to play through it. And maybe a stack of ability cards isn't the way to go. Like I don't know at this point, but it could be a number of things. But
Back to the balloon animals. He's a giant balloon animal.
yes. Great. Let's make knife good again.
So the final
Again.
thing
Hmm.
is any ideas for what like a story reward for this scenario could be?
A balloon animal.
Yeah. Yes, it can be this a giant balloon animal.
Yeah. Maybe you
So
could get
easy to
like the
pop.
strong man on your side or something. You could get like
Ooh.
one of the people who works at the carnival that if you free them, they become an ally for you. Maybe you could get like the big stuffed animal from the winning a prize sort of thing, and it's takes your
That would be
accessory or it takes up like both hand slots, but it gives you like 5 extra damage or something like that. Like,
yeah, it's like the supersized Mr. Potterson.
yeah, yes, exactly.
Ooh, fortune teller machine that can do token
Oh, that'd be
manipulation. Someone in
fun.
chat says
Yeah, I
magic
like that.
hat. Yeah, those are
Cherished
good.
keepsakes. Yeah, that's what I'm going for. I like the idea of like an invest like of like Leo running around with this giant teddy bear, and it's just
Yeah.
like bullets and arrows are getting shot into it, and nothing's like a.
Just
That's
using
just
it as a shield.
a giant hammer. That would be hilarious. Give a good melee weapon that's really like it would probably be like a shotgun thing where it would reward you for succeeding really well, but if you fail or if you don't succeed that well, then it's not that great. So
Yeah. Man, I think this would be a fun
this is really
scenario.
fun.
Just knowing the bare bones sketch of
Yeah.
it. But
I'm not into the whole amusement park carnival stuff. Like that's not my I'm not a fan of that theme, but I'm actually really liking the bones that we have set up. Yeah, you're right. These are great.
yeah, I think designing the game, like the game within the games, is the part that really speaks to me. That would be
Yeah.
fun to design.
Yeah.
All right, so I think that about wraps up our time. Thanks, Nick, for joining me,
Yeah.
and thanks everyone for being here and watching and being such an active part of chat. It was a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you all enjoyed it and got something out of it, whether it's the importance of balloon animals or something else. So reminders again, register for Farcom Con if you haven't already. Join the Farcom Con Discord channel. And coming up after this will be the adversarial draft format that we talked
Woo.
about on our last Mythos Busters episode. So go ahead and that one is not a streaming event. That you should go to the schedule and look at the adversarial draft directions because it will tell you exactly where to go. Basically, you're going into the Farcom Con Discord, but it will give you the directions of where to go, what channel to go in, and all that good stuff. Highly recommended. The draft is going to be fun. We haven't played it yet, but I know it's going to be fun.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see that happen.
And then after that, later today, our good friends at Optimal Play are going to be doing a deep, Forgotten Age campaign deep dive. That's at 3:30 my time Pacific, 5:30 Central.
Hmm.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much, and hope you're having a good Farcom Con so far. I know I am, and
Yeah.
we'll see you on the next stream.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.